All right, let's bring in three members of Parliament now to debate the latest developments in the House today. Rachel Bendayan is a Quebec Liberal MP and Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Tourism. Dane Lloyd is an Alberta Conservative MP and his party's critic for emergency preparedness. And Alistair MacGregor is the BC MP and the Public Safety critic for the NDP. It's good to see you all. Look, let's start with the tone of the debate we saw in the House today. Rachel Bendayan, let me start with you. You are a Jewish member of Parliament. Did the Prime Minister go too far in his comments today in question period, telling a Jewish Conservative MP, accusing her party of standing with people who wave swastikas?
Well, thanks for the question. And obviously, I was in the chamber during question period today and heard the exchange. I mean, quite honestly, the Prime Minister and anybody answering questions in the House is answering the Speaker, as you know very well. The way question period works, we do address questions and answers to the Speaker. The Prime Minister was not addressing any particular member, but I myself did personally see a Conservative member film a video standing beside a flag that contained a swastika. I can only imagine that would have been what the Prime Minister was referring to. I think that it's important to remember that we were not accusing or addressing any one person in particular, but that we have, and I have been distressed to see a Conservative member stand beside the swastika. Okay. In general, we have seen the Conservatives continue to promote this blockade.
The person asking the question, yes, it typically channels through the Speaker. The person asking the question is a descendant of Holocaust survivors, and how should she?
He did not refer to her in particular. Certainly not.
Okay, Mr. Lloyd, let me hear you on this. You also rose in question period to object to this and ask for the Prime Minister to apologize. Why do you think he needs to apologize here?
Well, I think it's ridiculous spin from the Liberal member to say that it's being addressed to the Speaker. It's not being addressed to the MP. We know full well that the Prime Minister loves using inflammatory and divisive language to divide and wedge Canadians. And I think he got caught in a situation where he thought he was saying something clever, but in fact he was saying something deeply, deeply offensive to all members of the House, all members of the Conservative caucus, and particularly to a Conservative member of Parliament who is Jewish. So the idea that the Prime Minister was not intending this remark to be pointed at her is absolutely ludicrous. And I would remind the Liberal member on the panel that the Prime Minister has been taken, pictures of him have been taken with swastikas in the background, and no member of our caucus would stoop so low as to accuse him of standing with people who wave swastikas. All
right. So the demand for an apology stands. Mr. MacGregor, let me hear you on this, and I guess in the broader sense of the tone this debate has taken over these measures in Canada, the protests and so on, and where you think we're at.
Well, it's quite obvious to anyone who's watching question period today that the temperature is at a boiling point. And I do think all members of Parliament do need to step back so we can find some constructive ways to address this. Apart from what happened in question period today, there were worrying signs from the get-go when the occupation started in Ottawa. We did see Nazi paraphernalia. We saw Stars of David being used. We also saw a Confederate flag. And so if we want to find a constructive way to address this, my colleague Peter Julian brought in a private member's bill that seeks to address these symbols of hate. And I hope that we can find an all-party consensus to agree to that type of legislation so that these symbols of hate are in fact banned from ever being used in a public space in Canada.
All right, let's talk about where we are in terms of the process of emergency orders here. Rachel Bendayan, all of the protests except for the one here in Ottawa, all of the border blockades, they've now been resolved without the need of the emergency orders. So tell me why the orders are still needed.
Well, we see very much so as we walk into Parliament every day that the Ottawa siege is still ongoing. And I would also point to the fact that just earlier today, there was an attempted blockade once again of the bridge at Windsor, which was successfully cleared by law enforcement today. But there is an ongoing threat to our borders. There is a need for the federal government to intervene at the request, I might say, of different premiers. We saw that Premier Doug Ford welcomed the introduction by our government of the Emergency Measures Act. And so we are here to help, as we have been from the beginning, with all of the tools at our disposal.
Mr. Lloyd, Conservatives have said they will vote against these emergency orders. Why don't you and your Conservative Party members believe they're needed?
Because we don't believe that the government has met the threshold that's laid out in the Emergencies Act. The Emergencies Act has 4 criteria, and the one that's pertinent to this case is a public order disturbance. And this has to be an issue that is a national crisis. And we're talking about, a few hundred protesters in downtown Ottawa. As you said, I mean, law enforcement at the border crossings has been successful without the use of the Emergencies Act at de-escalating the situation and removing the blockades. For the Prime Minister to invoke a never-before-used act that gives him extraordinary powers at this time is completely unnecessary, and it's political overreach.
Mr. MacGregor, why your leader and your party have expressed support for these measures with some caveats on how you want them applied, but why do you think they're still needed if under current tools for law enforcement they're able to resolve the protests and blockades we've been seeing in this country?
Well, I mean, with respect to Mr. Lloyd, we are at an unprecedented time. It's quite evident from the last 2 weeks that there has been a failure in federal leadership, which has led us to this point. And, with regard to his comments about this being a few protesters, no, this is an occupation. It ceased being a protest a couple of weeks ago. It is now an occupation. It has blockaded some of our major border crossings with the United States. We have small businesses. We have working families that are being impacted by this. And so, yes, they are extraordinary powers, but it's very important to remember they are subject to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. There are ways for parliamentary oversight to make sure that they are selectively applied.
Right. Are you saying existing powers that police and law enforcement officials possess wouldn't have been able to clear out this demonstration if maybe action had been taken earlier?
Well, again, the powers probably do exist, but whether they have actually been used, that, of course, we can see is not the case. So I think because the federal government was not there to coordinate intelligence and the activities of law enforcement from the get-go, we are now at the step where this unfortunately has to be used so that working families are not feeling the pinch from these occupations any longer than is necessary.
Rachel Bendayan, the Public Safety Minister, repeatedly today alluded to connections between some of the Ottawa protesters and those involved in the border blockade in Coutts, Alberta, who were allegedly armed and have been charged now with threatening to kill police officers. He used that in many ways as a justification to say, look, this might be what's going on. This is what we think is going on. That's why we need these orders. What connections, what evidence does the government have that that's what's happening in Ottawa, that there is this connection?
Look, there was a cache of weapons that was found in Coutts, Alberta. We are seeing that our borders are under threat. I mean, it is unprecedented to have the Canadian border literally blocked. Just at Windsor alone, we are talking about $400 million a day in goods that we're unable to cross. It is important to our government and indeed to all Canadians that we continue to be in control of our territory and of our borders.
But are we to understand from the comments say that the government believes there are members of the protest in Ottawa who are in that, call it an occupation if you want, who are armed in the streets of Ottawa, and if they are, what should police be doing about that?
I think that it is up to the police to conduct those kinds of investigations. And of course, we are concerned about linkages between the different protests across the country. As my colleague mentioned, I don't even believe that we should be calling them protests anymore. Protests are a form of expression covered under the Charter. What we are seeing are illegal blockades. And that is why we have brought in the extraordinary measures under the Act that we're discussing with you today. And we will have the opportunity to debate that legislation in the House.
Mr. Lloyd, how concerned are you about the possibility that there are protesters in Ottawa who are armed in the streets of Ottawa, and what should police be doing about that?
Well, let me start by saying that this militant faction at Coutts, which was brought down by the RCMP before the invocation of the Emergency Act, should be tried to the fullest extent of the law. This is absolutely unacceptable. But what I would say is that as far as Ottawa goes, I'm not concerned because the Parliamentary Protective Services and the RCMP have not warned members of Parliament to stay away from Parliament Hill. We're going to work. So if there was real hard intelligence that there was such a threat to us, I don't know how the government would be responsible in allowing us to sit in the House of Commons at this time.
Mr. MacGregor, when you hear those kinds of links between protesters arrested in Alberta and those who are taking part in what's happening in Ottawa, what more do you want to know?
Well, I will trust our law enforcement agencies to take an appropriate and measured response anytime they're sending in their service members. I think they do a very professional job in doing so. But again, while members of Parliament may not have received direct threats, I think some have, in fact. We really have to keep our focus on the businesses and workers in downtown Ottawa and the residents who have been subjected to an occupation now for more than 2 weeks.
All right, we'll leave it at that. Thank you all for your time tonight. I do appreciate it, and we'll talk again. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.